Let us begin. Welcome again to the second Rhodes event of the week, but ending this week on a high. It's been a great week. Really enjoyed it so far. I hope you have as well. Paul Tucker is well known to the Rhodes Centre. He has been here before. He's a great friend of the centre. And he also has a blissfully short bio. I love when people do this because, of course, someone of Paul's pedigree could say, and here's my bio, and I could spend 5 minutes reading it out. Instead of which, he just sent me this brilliantly brief one. It's a master of understatement. Paul Tucker is a research fellow at the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School and author of Global Discourse, Princeton University Press 22, and prior to this, Unelected Power, Princeton University Press 2018. For over 30 years, until late 2023, he was a central banker. 2013. Well, you wrote 23. Yeah, okay, yeah. I thought that was about it. You had a secret 10 years then, didn't you, if it was 2023? Paul is a fabulously interesting fellow because most people who begin having done the math tripos at Cambridge and then go into a career in central banking don't then write a book as big as this one, engaging with political philosophy, taking on the very thorny topic. And apropos, as a career as a central banker, you'd be thinking about this quite a lot, of under what conditions should democratic governments delegate, and when should they not? And what exactly is the legitimacy principle behind doing this, and how do we basically maintain those legitimacy principles? In this book, Global Discord, he decides to take on, I'm being slightly cheeky, American IR theory, if only to reform it in two ways. The first one is to basically bring David Hume into the conversation in a very interesting way. So that sort of Bernard Williams / David Hume frame that worked so well in the first book is there in the second one. And then the most important one here is to actually do something very practical, which is to say, beyond theorizing how cooperation works and why it's more common than we think, what are the likely futures that we're going to see? Because clearly we're at, to use the overworked term, an inflection point, right? A crossroads, a liminal moment, or whatever it happens to be. Just the old order is definitely in trouble, but we don't quite know what the new one's going to look like. So in that case, I'm glad that we have Paul as a guide because he has thought this through, and what he has to share with us is both sobering, but at the same time, I think actually much more hopeful than many of the depressing analyses that people are trotting out about the next foreseeable 10 years or so. And with that, I would like to welcome Paul back to Brown.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. It's very nice to be back in Brown. It's nice to be in the Rhodes Centre. Bill Rhodes, of course, is someone who I have known for many, many years. Thanks for your introduction. Is there a clicker, or do I need to use? No, this is okay.
Pull the drawer on the side.
No, it's all right.
No, it's all right. It's fine.
Let me say something about
There you go.
the logical structure of the book, which actually isn't the physical structure of the book, because I'm not going to cover the whole logical structure of the book. The book, it's an argument. The book is 450 pages long. 350 pages are an argument. And anyone that's interested in that can stop there and doesn't need to read the applications to economic regimes, trade and monetary stuff in the last 100 pages. Equally, actually, one could read the last 100 pages without the previous 350, although one wouldn't be persuaded, I think, by everything that is said in the past, in the last 100 odd pages. So at the beginning of the argument is a conception of legitimacy, which, as Marx says, draws on David Hume and Bernard Williams, and it synthesizes them. And there's a bit of novelty in that because Williams went off Hume around the middle of his career and said so in no uncertain terms. That conception of legitimacy drives what is really a contribution or an attempted contribution to international political theory, and that in turn drives an approach to international relations where Mark is basically right about what I'm trying to do. Grafted onto that are some observations about current geopolitics. So the international political theory I advocate, plus a take on current geopolitics, drives some principles for when states can legitimately pool authority power with other states and when they can legitimately delegate power to international organizations or international tribunals. And then there's the application to particular things. And the applications thing is worthwhile for me, not because I used to be an economic policymaker. That's just why economic applications are chosen. But the applications are there to try to demonstrate that these principles don't hang in the air, but could make a difference. Some headlines. I think the contest between the People's Republic and the West is going to last for a long century. Many people compare it with the Second German Reich in my own country in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. I don't think that is apt, because that was largely a struggle about power alone, whereas this is partly about ideology, as I'll come on to in a moment. It's plainly not the same so far as the Soviet bloc, the West, during the Cold War, because the Soviet bloc, and I think this is a tremendously important part of 20th century history, although they were at Bretton Woods and at the negotiations on the GATT and so on, they withdrew from those international regimes almost immediately. Stalin took them out, and that meant that the Cold War was played out in the security space, including lots of proxy wars, but not in commerce broadly defined. Whereas the British-French struggle from roughly 1689 to 1815 was contested in everywhere, including here, the coasts of India, Southeast Asia, Africa, everywhere, including Europe, and in everything, very much including commerce. And because it went over so long, there were moments of rapprochement. A trade treaty was negotiated sometime around the middle of the 18th century, and then for various reasons they fell into war again. And they didn't recapture that moment of having a trade treaty until the 1860s. The second consequence of my view that this is a struggle that will go on for a very, very long time is that if China stumbles, I don't think that's a great moment. So many people say, with good reason, that the Chinese economy and financial system has various vulnerabilities, and I think that's all right, or broadly correct, and China's economy could stumble quite badly over the next 5-10 years, or actually even next week. And if and when that happens, I think people, especially in the United States, but also to some significant degree in London, and less so perhaps in continental Europe, will declare, that's it then, back to normal US hegemony. And I just don't think that's true. China's economy is so vast and has critical mass in so many things that I think that it could stall for a decade and continue to build up its hard power in the world. Subject, of course, always to social and political dislocation. I think this contest will play out in international regimes and international organizations in a very significant way, in which we're only just at the beginning. And that's largely because Stalin took the Soviet bloc out of all the regimes in the mid-1940s, early 1950s. We have basically lived in an international world designed by some kind of partnership of Washington and the main capitals in Europe for 70-odd years. And almost any rising power, let alone a rising power with a different ideology, would want to challenge the prevailing order and system of things. But it is ideological. So here I go back to the French-British struggle. And this is a perspectival thing, and Paris would have been equally ideological, but from a different perspective. At the beginning of the 18th century, the problem my country had with France was the problem of Paris's aspirations to universalist absolute monarchy. And by the end of the 18th century, the problem was universalist revolution. And Burke, the Irish-British writer and politician, said at one point our problem isn't with French power, it's that it's the wrong kind of power. And that's ultimately the problem that the West has with China. It's not with Chinese people, it's not with Chinese civilization, it's with the party and the party's conception of itself. And the final thing to say by way of headlines is this is a world in which policy silos, and actually I also come to think while presenting the book over the past 3 months, academic silos will need to erode. In kind of trying to recall my previous life, it was possible to be a monetary policymaker and a financial policymaker without knowing anything much about trade policy. You had to know some trade economics, for goodness sake, but you didn't need to know about how the WTO worked, how those negotiations worked. Or if you knew about all of that, you didn't need to know about war and peace or the laws of the sea or human rights law or environmental law. We are going into a period which is very different in that respect. And we haven't really been there since the mid-1970s. The book is dedicated to Paul Volcker and a man called Jacques Larosière from France, because they're the last generation of economic policymakers to have lived in that world. And there's a story that illustrates this. When in the beginning of the 1970s, this country kind of flirts with falling apart, civil rights protests, Watergate, Vietnam War, and then on top of it all, Bretton Woods, the monetary regime falls apart. And people tend to say, and I think this is very misleading, well, the Bretton Woods only lasted 1945 or something till the 1970s. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. This was the end of a commodity standard, and we had had a commodity standard for 250 years, completely uncharted territory. And in Washington, the question was, well, how on earth can they sustain the dollar being used around the world in circumstances where no one has any faith in the capacity of the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury to sustain low and stable inflation. And indeed, they were right not to have that faith. That problem wasn't solved until the late 1980s. So much economic policy stuff. In the mid-70s, a delegation went from Washington, I think state and treasury, but I'm not sure about that, to Saudi Arabia to have an incredibly important discussion with Saudi Arabia, which amounted to the second of the great post-World War bargains. And it amounted to, we, Washington, will provide you with more security assistance, greater arms sales, etc., and you will make a commitment to continue invoicing oil in dollars. So if you read in the papers, someone is starting to invoice oil in renminbi, or there are discussions about moving away from invoicing oil or something else important in dollars, this is gigantic significance. And we live in a world where policymakers are going to have to understand other policymakers. The book begins, first lines of the book, which cite Aditi, are someone walking into my office in, I think, the spring of 2009, but to be honest, I can't quite remember. It's either late 08 or early 09. And they say, the Federal Reserve has just refused India a swap line. Doesn't matter what a swap line is technically. Just think of it as a line of credit from the Federal Reserve to a foreign central bank to help them navigate the terrible global financial crisis. So someone comes into my office and says, the Federal Reserve has just refused India a swap line, a line of credit. And my response was, don't they realize India is going to be a power? In other words, I thought it was above the Federal Reserve's pay grade. Now, I want to tell a story to kind of frame the problems in the international system as designed in the image of the United States and Europe. I'm going to do a hands-up question, I'm afraid. How many people here know about the state-owned enterprises subsidies case between China and the United States? Okay, so this is about a decade ago, and China's state-owned enterprises, and there are many state-owned enterprises in China, and they're very big, they start subsidizing their exports, and so imports into the United States. This reduces the cost, and so will increase the take-up. And Washington responds by saying, no, subsidies are illegal under the WTO. These are subsidies, therefore they're illegal. If you don't stop them, we are permitted to use countervailing measures. Countervailing measures is just legal speak for we can put tariffs in place to push the price back up. Beijing responds by saying, no, you can't do that, because actually these state-owned enterprise subsidies, they are not subsidies of the kind that are banned by the treaty. The disagreement goes through the WTO dispute system. It ends up with the appellate board. The appellate board decides in favor of China on the grounds that state-owned enterprises are not, in their view, I think the expression is public bodies, as defined in the treaty. Now, there are two or three things to be said about this. I mean, in some senses, the court is just out of its depth in the way that the Supreme Court here finds itself out of its depth. And in another sense, the decision is just silly because plainly state-owned enterprises are under the control of the party, although I think the American side didn't make many submissions on the role of the party. But what one would normally expect to happen in a functioning political system, certainly in a parliamentary system, but even in a congressional system, is the backward-looking judgment would stand, and the policymakers would get together and say, well, we really don't want this to be forward-looking policy because it's going to cause enormous irritation between the big players in the system. We need a diplomatic session. And so what would have happened in the thing I'm conjuring is Washington and Beijing would sit down together, probably with the other two contemporary great powers in trade, the EU and Tokyo, and they would thrash out a bargain where China would end up giving up some of its gains, and the US and Europe would recoup some of their losses, and everyone would be, China would be a bit less gleeful, and the United States would be a bit less fed up, and some trade professionals would write that out into a form that could go into the treaty. I couldn't do that, but it's the kind of thing that in my old sphere I could do. People exist that can do that kind of thing. And everybody in life would continue, except it can't, because everybody in the WTO, all the members of the WTO, have a veto. It doesn't work in the same way as the old GATT. You might say, oh, that's rather awkward, because we've got this complete standoff between the two biggest economies in the world. This veto thing's a bit of a problem if it always applies. Let's get rid of it, except you can't get rid of it because everyone has a veto over getting rid of the veto. And so the punchline here is, so now go back to the negotiation of the WTO. So this isn't the point about the terms of Chinese entry, on which there are things to be said, but the negotiation of the WTO is that two things are going on, and those draft people and negotiators, a minor thing and a big thing. The first thing is they think that they are drafting the perfect treaty that can, since it can never be changed, that can continue forever and cover all states of the world. That's just incompetent. I mean, nobody in public office that's any good at what they do thinks that they are writing things down which will be good for history. And what lies behind that is, since actually they can't possibly have thought they were writing the perfect contract, they're thinking, well, actually, the stakes are never going to be high because nobody is ever going to rise and become a power that has a different view of the international economy than ours. Whoever rises will acquiesce or converge to our essentially liberal view of, in a European sense of liberal, actually worth saying that, whenever I use liberal, I mean the European sense of liberal, that kind of liberal view of how trade works. And that, of course, was just wishful thinking, since this is happening after 1989 and Tiananmen Square. And it's not, my point isn't that thinking that economic liberalism or liberalization could lead to political liberalization was a crazy thought. I don't think it was a crazy thought. I didn't myself at the time put a very high probability on it, but I think it was perfectly reasonable for other people to put a higher probability on it than I did. But what was crazy was to put all your chips on it. to say that actually this isn't something that's reasonably likely or, in my view, possible, but this is something that is destined, inscribed in the runes of the universe and will happen, and therefore we don't have to worry about the universal vetoism because no one powerful is going to rise up that ever disagrees with the conception of trade implicit in the treaty, and that was wishful thinking. It's a kind of end of history. It's a concrete manifestation of the end of history moment in Washington. Now, another stack that as that's a kind of problem about the design of the world. Another hands-up question, I'm afraid. Who has heard of Document 9? So this is very interesting, and it's the answer I get from almost everywhere. I would guess that 1 to 1.5% of the audiences I've spoken to have heard of Document 9. Everybody should have heard of Document 9. It was leaked from the Central Committee of the party in 2013, so roughly a year after Leader Xi became leader. And a few years before, all those people were clapping at Davos to Leader Xi, and I suspect they didn't know about Document 9. The Document 9 has in it the 7 no's. I can only read it in translation. I think if one could, one should definitely read it in Mandarin. It's a very, for what it's worth, speaking as a former bureaucrat, I think it's a very well composed piece of work. I mean, it's skillful. It makes its points, and it makes its points in eloquent language. 5 of its points are essentially a negation of everything that we stand for, and 2 of its points are an affirmation of part of what they stand for and a warning to their people. So these aren't literal quotes because it's a slide. No to promoting constitutional democracy, no to promoting universal values, which they explain why in the document, no to civil society, individual rights, no to neoliberalism, which they define as total marketization, no to, some people might agree with that in the West, no to the Western idea of journalism via freedom of the press, and then things like no to historical nihilism against the history of the party in New China, and no to questioning the socialist nature of socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is my favorite and of course needs saying, if you're them. And so this is an incredibly important document because what it says is we just, and it was sent out to NGOs and schools and government departments, and this is, you will not be seen advocating any of these things. So the voices that had been advocating liberalism of various kinds, bits diluted or not, in the PRC, they're being told, no, it is policy that you will not do that. And so, of course, people very sensibly stopped doing that. So this doesn't make it a civilizational struggle, I want to say now. I think it's tremendously important that, and as I was writing the book, I came to think this was more and more important, that South Korea and Japan notably, but there are others, are Confucian heritage societies who have become constitutional democracies without losing their sense of their own traditions or history or local norms. But it is very much a point about the role of the party in China. For anyone that's interested in the book, Chapter 9 is about that. So we've got this ideological thing, which the challenge is, contest is everywhere and in everything. And I think that the book has, and I think roughly there are 4 scenarios for the next half a century or more. So not the full century of the length of time I think the contest will go on. Lingering status quo, superpower struggle, new Cold War, new world order. For what it's worth, I think new world order isn't at all likely until other states have risen and make the world a multipolar world. Most obviously India, could be Indonesia. But actually the best way of thinking about it is any economy with a vast population that has the prospect to grow reasonably rapidly for a few decades, and so that one gets compound growth and the power of the exponent. I don't think it's possible for the great policymakers in DC or elsewhere, or actually in Beijing for that matter, to say, well, we're going to go for number 1, 2, or 3, and here are the policies we're going to pursue, and it will work, or it will work with sufficient probability. I think actually one needs to step back and think about it more broadly, even though I think the scenarios are useful for thinking through how things may play out in different fields, including for the business community, including for the military. Instead, I think one needs to have a kind of way of thinking about international relations in the background that can help guide policy. And it is here, as Mark says, that I do try and find an alternative approach to the standard. I mean, international relations is taught, I think, as though when you're going through graduate school, there's a secret moment where you're invited to a session and you see somebody in a dark room and they tell you whether you're going to be a Hobbesian or a Kantian or a Grotian. And if you're a Hobbesian, you will dedicate the rest of your life to discussing international anarchy, the futility of international organizations and power. If you were given the Kantian, I hope that was captured on the tape. If you're given the Kantian card, you will write largely about human rights and about the power of reason to bring people together. And if you are given the Grotian middle way card, you will write much more about international regimes and interdependence. But you'll have the slight problem of how to ground where you are, because there isn't a figure. Grotius wasn't, and his followers successors weren't quite in the intellectual range of Hobbes and Kant. And so I do think we can get through that by drawing on David Hume and Bernard Williams. And here, very briefly, it's not the main thing I want to say, but here very briefly is one way of thinking about it. 2x2 matrix, or a ridiculous oversimplification. So one dimension is, can we assume sociability amongst people and among countries or not? And is normative authority always top-down from a sovereign, or can it be bottom-up? So the Hobbesians are in the top left-hand corner. There's no natural sociability. Power is top-down. We need a sovereign. That doesn't exist in the international sphere, and therefore it's as I described earlier. And in a sense, 19th century legal positivists are also don't believe in natural sociability, but power is now bottom up through contract, through treaties, but you may not stick to them. The Hobbesians and the natural law Grotians, including Pufendorf, live in the top right cell. So there is sociability, but authority is going to be top-down in some sense, even where the top-down doesn't mean necessarily from a person or a body, but from reason or deductive rationalism. And the bottom right cell is basically empty in most of the literature from the 17th century onwards, except that's what I think where Hume fits, given his articulation of the role of convention, habit, of opinion. And I'm going to kind of put that, I'm not going to elaborate on that here, other than say this is a story where legitimation norms are tremendously important, that the legitimation norms will typically be endogenous to the nature of the basic order that generates order and trust and protection, safety, and so conditions for cooperation. And as I've argued already gestured to already by mentioning document 9, those legitimation norms are going to vary enormously across states, or certainly states with different traditions. So there's potentially a tug of war as we venture out, as the United States or any European state, into the international arena. There is potentially a tug of war between the legitimation norms that hold things together at home and the thinner norms that we can potentially share with international counterparts. And I think of the world, in a sense, the output of the book analytically is a conception of the world in concentric circles, where the outermost circle of cooperation, is a circle of peaceful coexistence. And you have to maintain peace with those you need to maintain peace with. It's a realist point. So I say somewhere in the book, don't pretend you can keep someone beyond the pale if actually you can't. And the People's Republic are like that. This is a country so powerful that we will have to treat with them. But given that they seem, and many people think, violate some of the most basic human rights norms, the peremptory norms of positive international law, you wouldn't want to be over-dependent on them, and actually symmetric, nor would they want to be over-dependent on us. So you would want thin commerce with them rather than thick commerce. Next circle in is a world where the peremptory norms are recognized and broadly abided by everybody, and so you can feel a bit more secure trading. And as you can see, as you move in, the thickness and deepness of the cooperation can increase, so there can be a lot between Europe and the United States, there can be even more within Europe, there can be even more within a state. So pulling all of that together, and before moving on, how long have I got left, Mark? Okay, that's fine. Pulling all of that together and summarizing some principles for policy making, one of them is avoid wishful thinking. So that is realist in the normal sense of realism in US international relations without the rest of the baggage. And actually, I think it's the most important thing to take from Thucydides. I don't think the inevitability of conflict is the most important thing to take from Thucydides. If one reads Thucydides, and one should, although he says it's all going to be very awkward given Athens and Sparta are jealous of each other, I mean, the amount of contingency going on is just, is almost overwhelming. And that is actually, the book just wouldn't be that long if it wasn't about all of the contingencies. It would be much shorter. The second thing I want to emphasize as a principle is that where the stakes are high, policy should be robust. Economists mean by that minimax, which, going more slowly, means minimizing the maximum costs of bad states of the world, and going more slowly still, working from the end, bad things are going to happen, call those scenarios. Think through what are the maximum costs of those scenarios crystallizing. Okay, now we've identified what the maximum costs could be. How can we minimize those maximum costs? In doing so, we might not, but we might push up the probability of the bad states of the world, but the bad states of the world won't be as bad when they crystallize. For what it's worth, this is a way of unpicking the Mearsheimer position on the Ukrainian war, because he thinks in terms of probabilities rather than impacts. So I would argue, for instance, that extending membership in NATO might, I think I could concede, it might have made conflict more likely. It's made the impact of that conflict less overwhelmingly bad for the West than otherwise. It hasn't made it less bad for the Ukraine. And related to that, and this will be tremendously important in terms of where I end up, is it means that the systems that are really important to preserving our way of life, they need to be resilient. Democracy, by the way, is on the whole a pretty resilient thing for reasons we could discuss. So I want to pick out three concrete principles for the design and operation and bothering to participate or deciding to participate in international regimes. One is, do not do so if there's a reasonable prospect that it will undermine order at home or undermine the legitimation norms that prop up the order at home. Secondly, this goes to the WTO example. Liberal states should have a bias towards universalism in regimes, but not in ways that prohibit or de facto rule out deeper cooperation amongst coalitions of the willing. There's an incredibly important story about trade in this. Given the story I've told about the WTO sclerosis, the action ends up being in things like the Pacific trade Pact and in the EU. But it's a miracle of our history that these regional preferred trade pacts are permitted at all. And this arose when the European coal and steel community was being formed in the 1950s. There were many trade lawyers and experts on the GATT who thought it was probably illegal under the GATT, that the GATT was to be the only trade regime among states. And so what were these Europeans doing? But such was the Washington waved through the EU coal and steel community and common market, which created a precedent which we rely on today. And finally, don't put international judges or international organization bosses in the positions of being the de facto rulers. Now, I want to say something just to end about how the international monetary system fits with this. So it is, and I've already touched on this by the story about Saudi Arabia. If you issue the international reserve currency, this was as true for my country a century or more ago as it is for the United States now, one's security relationships around the world will tend to underpin and spread the use of one's currency. Hence the story about Saudi Arabia. But of course, it works the other way around, too, in that issuing the dominant international reserve currency makes it cheaper for your government to borrow and your companies to borrow and for your banks to act internationally and be the dominant banks in the world, and therefore it makes it easier to be the hegemon than otherwise. And actually, when Europe is irritated, as it not infrequently is, by the way that Washington uses the power of the dollar, they should, one of the important messages of my book is, remember that we import our security umbrella from the United States. But equally, when the United States gets irritated and says Europe should do a lot more, the United States doesn't mean that do so much more that you emerge as a self-standing superpower on your own. In my previous life, some very senior, famous American policymakers used to say to me, I think I understood why they said it, they'd say, it's incredibly irritating. We have one seat at this table, and the Europeans have, I can't remember, I'm going to say 5, it may not be 5. And my response was always the same. I heard this over about 20 years. And my response was always the same, is, oh, you'd like it a lot less if there was only one person from Europe, because that would mean that Europe had decided again to be a self-standing hard power. So there's a very delicate path to be found in terms of Europe doing more to defend itself, which I completely support, but not so much more that the kind of current hierarchy is toppled, which of course will partly depend upon the outcome of future elections. But here's the other thing. The standard analysis of the advantage of being the reserve currency issuer is that it has this annuity advantage, which I've already described. And that's a thing, and I think it's not a small thing, but I don't think it's the biggest thing. I think the biggest thing lies elsewhere, and it's best illustrated by the global financial crisis. So there we are, in 2007, 2008, the kind of gradual and then complete implosion of the US and Western financial system spreading across the world, basically caused by mendacity, incompetence, and any list of other bad things you can think of in the United States, and in my country up to a point, but my country isn't the reserve currency issuer. And so it's driven from here, both in its deep causes and its first manifestations. What would happen to any normal country in the world, is that in those circumstances their bond yields would go up. And so just as fiscal policy needed to come to the rescue domestically, it would become more expensive to do so, constraining one's capacity to do so. We had a little example of that in the UK back in the fall. Instead, what happened during the worst of the global financial crisis is there was a global flow of funds into US Treasury bills, into US short-term bonds, because they are the most liquid instrument in the galaxy, and that's what people want to hold on to there. So this is amazing. This is a gift from God, which is that in the worst, this is the idea of resilience, and behind it, minimax, in a really terrible state of the world, you have an inbuilt cushion. And so it would be very peculiar if Beijing didn't think we would like some of that. And we are going to push with patience for the renminbi to be a significant world reserve currency, if not the most significant reserve currency. I'll stop there. I've tried to sketch high-level, lower-level stuff in ways which I hope gesture at least some of the connections between the arguments. Thanks very much for listening.
And in a break with tradition, because why not, we have two discussants. We have Aditi Sazrabote, who will be joining Brown in the fall. Welcome to Aditi from everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Aditi. And we have Jeff Colgan, who's been here for a while.
Old and stale.
Thank you, Paul, for sharing this book with us. It was such a pleasure to read. I learned so much about literatures that I haven't engaged with a lot in the political philosophy fields especially. And I want to just highlight first some of the points that struck me to be, that stuck with me while reading the book, which is your scaling up of the first political question to the international level. So thinking about how, the idea of securing order, protection, trust, safety, the conditions of cooperation at the international level create this new legitimation problem, not only in the sense of it should be done within the state and by the state, but also creating a question of legitimacy between states at the international level. And so as I see in my reading, the question then driving this book is how in this international problem does the order, whatever it looks like, deliver higher order public goods of safety, security, peace, prosperity, both in economics and in the security field. And that you identify there's two confounders to doing this right now. One is, in doing this, how do we engage with rising powers whose value systems might be very different to the current liberal international order, if we want to go there, and the need to then have some kind of acceptance of an idea of legitimacy and what that looks like for these states and for the core in sort of engaging with these states, whatever scenario we might end up at. So as I see your argument, then you're sort of calling for almost a bottom-up approach to reordering the system, the international system, one that would represent and recognize these different values amongst all states participating in it, while also making sure that legitimacy question is addressed. So within this, I want to talk about three things. Towards the end of the book, one is on international money, the role of the centrality of the dollar, central bank swaps, because I can't not, and geopolitics, and the comparison of maybe Basel and the IMF in international financial governance. And I see in the economic field that maybe in many ways it's a lot less contentious than other areas of cooperation, such as security or trade. But I think it also poses a much bigger problem when it comes to the legitimacy side of the governance question. I agree with you that at this point, I think through the course of at least all of our lives here, we're going to see a continuance of the lingering prominence of the US dollar. But I also agree that we might be heading towards something more between the lingering status quo and a superpower struggle. In the current system for the US dollar centrality, I want to talk about two things. The first is, which you spoke about already a little bit, is how reserve systems or reserve currencies are tied as much to security relations as they are to economic conditions. And not just in what upholds the system in terms of the security agreements that might, create that acceptance of use of a currency, but also in how these systems have ended in the past. So thinking about, we have an N of 2, I guess, really, but the way that currency systems have changed historically has been especially ugly. And to think about then whatever shift we might be going towards, whether it's more of a multipolar order or a superpower struggle, is, I guess I would say I'm a little less optimistic about this not happening the same way. And I'd like to hear more about maybe more of that encouragement of the hopefulness that's in your book, that we might be able to move towards something that looks more multipolar, perhaps without repeating those ugly histories of how currency systems have ended in the past. The second, more immediate point on this that strikes me is the point of legitimacy of a reserve currency. So as you alluded already, the U.S. gains a lot of benefits by being the issuer of the reserve currency. And I agree with you, and I think we agree on this. We've talked about this a bit already, which is that also entails a great deal of responsibility as an issue of the reserve currency. But it doesn't seem like that's something that U.S. institutions, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, even the government, really take as seriously. And I think this poses two problems for legitimacy. One is the international acceptance of it. We can see that I don't think we have any meaningful shift available, any options available yet. But we are seeing a sort of pushback against the US dollar right now and sort of hinting at this lack of legitimacy. But the second side is also we're seeing a lot of pushback against the system within the US, not just in terms of currency. So I do think in whatever sort of reordering we see, it's not just about engaging with values from different value systems from China, but also the fact that there has been this very anti-democratic push even within the Western world. I'm now going to turn to my favorite discussion, which is currency swaps and geopolitics. And I think this ties a little bit into the conversation of also responsibility of the issuer of the dollar, which is, I think, providing central bank swaps is one way in which the US, the Fed, lives up to this responsibility, which is when we need dollar liquidity, there's one entity that can provide it. And I agree with you that I think there might be need for widening access to this conditionality-free liquidity. But currently, we're not seeing that mindset within the Fed itself. And so I'm curious to hear how you think what do you think it might look like to see the U.S. actually take up its responsibility as an issuer of the global reserve? The second is, in my reading historically about swap lines, in my conversations with policymakers, and I think they say this out loud even like in the public, I've definitely read it elsewhere, it's always been about international politics as well. I don't think they've often shied away from the international relations side of who they assist when it comes to crises. I saw this at least in the 1960s, and even in FOMC discussions, they certainly talk about national security, geopolitics, personal affinities as mattering to who gets these lines. And that brings me to a question of then, if we see a Federal Reserve moving into this more geopolitical, overtly politicized role at the international level, should it be the actor then taking on this role at any point, or do we need to maybe see this coming from elected authorities? And I want to also quickly touch on the case of India, but in a more contemporary context, not about denying a swap to it in 2008, but if the Fed is going to engage in geopolitics, this might be a prime time to start doing this with India, because it might help sort of shift its, help pivot it away from Russia. These are very long-standing diplomatic ties that India and Russia have. India has been far too quiet about the war in Ukraine. I should say I don't condone its ambivalence at all. But I think instead of maybe public shaming, sort of actually providing an alternative to a good superpower ally might be the way to go. And this might also help countries sort of stay engaged in the dollar system and not move away or look to pivot away to create some kind of more unstable multipolar order, or even RMB and dollar blocks. Although I can't imagine India going into an RMB block anytime soon either. But again, just to sort of recap then, in playing this geopolitical role, I think this goes beyond the mandate of central banks. I think you'd agree on that as well. So I'd love to hear what you think of, maybe whose money should be used, and does it become taxpayer money if it's the government handling this, or does this come from the central bank? My last point is on the role of the IMF versus the BIS. So I was surprised at your example of Indonesia, given a lot has happened since 97, 98. And I do think that the IMF has certainly toned down its, overtly interventionist stance into a country's monetary sovereignty, almost to the other extreme though. So thinking about what's happening in, say, Pakistan or Ghana right now, there's also a cost of delay when they don't do something. So we're seeing it move from one legitimacy problem of maybe intervening into a country to doing almost not enough. And I don't know where that lies in any kind of any of the scenarios you pose, or even now, just to think about what is that middle ground of what international institutions should be doing in a legitimate way. On the flip side, we've got the BIS, which is probably the most nimble and effective international body when it comes to policy making. But it's also a large part, I think, due to the fact that this is run by unelected authorities, delegated authorities that don't really have to, go through the arduous negotiations and political hoops at home, which makes policy making much easier. I think it's also that agreements are much looser and they sort of come up almost more organically. And you ask in the book, then are the powers denizens too powerful in the tower's denizens, sorry. And I would say perhaps yes, but at this point that might be the only way to go, given, it seems to be the most effective organization. I should say I surprised myself in saying a lot of these things, but just thinking about how, what is the alternative? Because we've got on the one hand, maybe the IMF has exercised too much discretion in terms of encroaching in sovereignty or doing not enough. On the other side, we've got something like the BIS that has vast amounts of power, does it very, very quietly and opaquely, but does a lot more and a lot more effectively. So I'll stop there. And thank you again for sharing your book with me.
Thank you.
Over to you, John.
Well, thank you. This is a lovely book. It is an intellectually demanding book, and it is a book about a great many things, as you can tell even from the talk. One has the feeling of kind of cannons firing off in many different directions as one reads it. And I think that follows, from the sort of extraordinary quality of the mind of the author. And so Sir Paul is not only a very smart man who has read and thought deeply about a huge swath of economics and political science, but he is also a kind of policy career that is unmatched by anyone up here. And so that career at the heart of global financial governance really informs his thinking. And I was going to say that this book is about at least four big things, which I'll just enumerate very quickly. One is that it's an account of how world politics works since 1945 or so. Second is how values and interests are interconnected and ultimately inseparable. Third, it's about how to design international institutions. And fourth, how the West should live with China and other autocracies as well, right? Now, of these four, I think my favorite is the second one, engaging with the realist notion of states pursuing their national interest and showing how you can't even make sense of that claim without thinking about values. And that puts him in the tradition of John Ruggie, who until recently was Paul's colleague at Harvard's Kennedy School, until unfortunately John passed away. Paul argues that interests are infused with values, and values matter most when they are incentive compatible rather than utopic. And I think that insight is something that sort of goes through the book, and it really runs into some really great stuff in the conclusion about how democracies need to avoid international organizations that compromise that legitimacy. There's also, I'll just note sort of parenthetically, that some really wise words about the Bank for International Settlements, which is perhaps the most important international organization that most people have never heard of. And Paul argues that the BIS favors the wealthy and the interests of finance without sufficient attention to broader interests, which I guess he was preaching to the choir, at least me personally. I think that is a point well worth making, and it comes with great authority from someone like Paul. Okay, so I've said a whole lot of nice things, and I guess I wouldn't be fully doing my job if I just said nice things about the book. And so I'm going to focus on two questions. One is, what do we mean by international order, which is a concept really at the heart of this book? And second, because I'm personally a scholar and a student of energy politics, and I want to take advantage of Paul's expertise in financial markets, I have to ask about what we should make of recent Chinese efforts to get oil payments in renminbi rather than US dollars. Because while that might sound like a very technical topic, it's sort of right at the foundations of the whole global financial system. Okay, so let me start with the first one, which is sort of, what do you mean by international order? And this is a key term not only for Paul's book, but for really the whole field of international relations. And I went, like a good student, I went to the index and looked, what do we see in the index for order? And it doesn't point to a central definition. It does point to some pages that helped. And so I'm going to just read a couple of quotes. One from page 18. He says, realists talk mostly about war and peace. Internationalist liberals mainly about the regimes for trade, the environment, and other technical collective action problems. And constructivists about human rights, law, norms, and so on. These positions could be associated with, respectively, order, system, and society. Okay, so that gives us one clue about where Paul's coming from. And then another one on page 180, order, capital O, order, can create a door to a system of planned regimes. Right? And he goes on to say that system is the realm of institutions as express rules of the game, agreed on by rational calculus. Okay, so I think the text implies that Paul sees order with a capital O as something like a combination of two IR concepts, namely anarchy and polarity. Right? Polarity refers to the number of top-level, top-tier great powers, be it bipolar or unipolar or multipolar. And anarchy and polarity are the background condition to things like a balance of power, which may or may not grow up on that, and ultimately to any institutions that we might build on top of that. And if I've got that right, Paul's notion of order is actually quite different from the way that IR theorists typically use the term. Right? So John Eikenberry, another scholar of the idea of international order, defines order as the governing arrangements among a group of states, including its fundamental rules, principles, and institutions. And other scholars like Robert Gilpin would agree, although there are many, many definitions for international order, that's something that IR scholars, unfortunately, are all too good at, is defining the term in different ways. But this might all sound like a sort of definitional thing, but it matters for at least two reasons. The first is kind of practical, right? Paul's use of the term international order is just plain different from the one that is used in the debates that we sometimes see in magazines like Foreign Affairs about whether the liberal international order is dead or alive and kicking or in need of reform or whatever it is, right? Most of that debate is about the institutions and rules that Paul would refer to as system, not as order, right? So there's kind of technical thing we just have to clarify, right? Okay. The second reason, though, that this matters is more fundamental, and it has to do with the extent to which international institutions and rules can be isolated from anarchical power politics. And until Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Germany in particular had this notion that it could have a set of rules about European energy markets that would be separate from great power politics, despite many warnings that this was a very bad idea, right? And now Paul is way too smart to make the same mistake, to think that the rules of the international system are isolated from power politics. You can see this from the text, right? He's way too smart for that. But even so, there is at the heart of this argument a conceptual separation between power politics and the rules of the international system that I find somewhat uncomfortable. There's a tension here. To me, and to many American scholars, though unlike a lot of European scholars, the rules of the game are inextricably bound up in power politics, both as an expression and as an instrument of power. And it's not just that order shapes the system, but also the system shapes order. Okay? So for instance, Russia is using a functional issue like energy to try to pursue a reordering of great power politics. Right? Right now that's happening in terms of a de facto energy embargo on Europe. Okay. There's lots more to say that. In fact, we could probably have a whole seminar on just this concept alone. I'm going to leave it at that. But I want to talk about the second question, which is what should we make of Chinese efforts to get at least some of the world's market for oil to be paid for in renminbi rather than US dollars? And I love that, unlike many of my IR colleagues, Paul recognizes the centrality of energy and oil for world politics, right? So in that first chapter, he says that the post-1945 system was shaped largely by two grand bargains with the United States, right? One bargain with the United States was with Western Europe and Japan, manifested by a set of military alliances and economic arrangements. But the other grand bargain was between the United States and the petrostates of the Persian Gulf and North Africa. And that underpins the world's energy supply. It is hugely important. I have spent 10 or 12 years banging on this drum for a while, and so it's very gratifying to see somebody of Paul's pedigree sort of recognize that. In my work, I've analyzed what are known as the sort of oil for security deals that exist between the United States and various petrostates, including most prominently Saudi Arabia. And those deals represent something of a swap, not a swap line, whereby the U.S. offers military protection in exchange for some oil-related economic benefits. It used to be the actual oil, right? There was like oil sent, or the profits from the oil sent to the United States. But now, one of those core benefits is that big petrostates demand payment for oil in U.S. dollars. They continue to do so. And that contributes to the dollar being the global reserve currency. Recently, China has tried to get the Saudis to sell oil in renminbi. They've been sort of whispering sweet nothings into the Saudis' ears. That relationship is growing more and more prominent. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner at this point, not just in oil, but broadly. And so, having said that, how much they've succeeded and how much they are likely to succeed in the future in convincing the Saudis to price or to demand payment in US dollars, that's kind of opaque, at least to most observers. And so what I thought I would ask Paul to comment on is this: how big a deal is this if the Chinese can accomplish it? How likely is it? And how can the US counter it if there is such a thing? What sweeteners or instruments might the US government try to use in reaction to that? So thank you so much for a great book.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jeff.
Thank you. Before I ask Paul to respond, I know some people are going to move out, etc. I'd actually like to take a couple of questions from the audience. So we can do 3 from the audience. You can add that on, and then I can just ask you to respond. That would be great.
Yeah.
So who would like the first question? That gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Not really an expert here, but the Chinese document 9, I'm still in awe of that, how little is known about it, and those the 5 no's you listed. I was I couldn't even get past the very first no, which is in your translation, and I just want a little more clarity, said something like no to constitutional democracy, and sort of, it's, what was that basically to do with liberal democracy? Because there's a big debate about that it's not liberal, it's not democracy that's been in decline or whatever the order issue, but it's the liberalism that's sort of under, so you have illiberal democracies, and I come from India, and I mean, that's been the characterization. To what extent it would, this no to constitutional democracy, because would apply to China, because they themselves write it in their constitution, that they are a people's democracy. So would they be okay with a kind of a global order where democracy is there, but it's just not on liberal terms? And I want a little more because it's so important. It's the first no of a very important document. Thank you.
Just take that as a comment, take that
Okay.
as a question, answer that. Anyone else want in or right there? And then Kate, you get number 3.
Hi, thank you for being here. So on your last slide, you had a sort of questioning whether China is going to try to heighten its position as the provider of a global reserve currency. And my question is, if China starts to try to do that, and it sounds like they already are, to what extent are other countries going to potentially force some kind of political adjustment to the stances that they have on Document 9, for example? Like, are other countries going to force them to become more liberal politically, or would they potentially see China as an authoritarian regime as more of a strength, or more of something that provides legitimacy or stability to their ability to become a provider of a global reserve currency?
And then Kate gets the last one.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask you a rather difficult question that was posed to me by a very high-level official at the World Bank last year, who was describing his own and his colleagues' existential crisis about the reordering of world politics and the World Bank's place in it. So it very much fits into the themes you're talking about. And as he was saying, we don't understand what happened to the order we had. We don't understand what the new order is going to be, and we have no idea what our particular role is and how the World Bank should respond. And so I'm wondering if you... He's like, what do you think? Just dead silence, right? So it goes to this question of order and reordering, but also who is responsible, who constitutes that, who drives that reordering, and how do extant institutions respond to that? And then there's a separate question about the renminbi. I was surprised when years ago the renminbi was added to the SDR in IMF accounts, and it was like buried on page 23 of the Financial Times. For me, that seemed like a very significant signal that renminbi was becoming a hard currency and that a significant shift was going to happen. Today I have to wonder, why is Saudi Arabia even considering not switching to the renminbi? What are the reasons why we would not sell oil in renminbi today? What is the calculus behind that we need to understand to really, I think, thoroughly understand sort of what's happened to the exchange of the U.S. dollar?
Paul, take it away.
Thank you very much. If I may, all great questions, and I mean it. Starting with the third one about the World Bank and what should drive us. I mean, this goes back to the first political question, and as Aditi said, the first international political question. And I argue this in the book, but ultimately, order, safety, protection is kind of local, mainly. That when I go out of here, the fact that I don't expect to be mugged, or if I am, I think I've got some channels of redress, is something that happens locally. Now, international relations scholars a US realist brand will say the key thing that drives the state is survival. But this is an incomplete thought. It's one thought too few, in that states are kind of bundles of people, and people need to be prepared to fight. And that depends on how they feel about our way of life. And the key thing for me, if I make a different kind of presentation, because I agree with Jeff, the most important part of this book is, I think, the stuff about interests and social norms and values. It's about what lies at what lies at the bottom or runs through how we feel about our way of life, and how far are we prepared to go to preserve it, of who we've managed to become, because this doesn't involve celebrating our own history, and how far can we compromise, adapt, recognize a rising power without losing our sense of ourselves and without sacrificing our way of life. And I think actually that's something that the members of the World Bank bring to the table. I don't actually think it's tremendously for members of the bureaucracy in the World Bank, admirable though they are, to think about all the IMF, which will actually, can I respond to one of Aditi's points? Aditi makes a very powerful point about the IMF, and I a bit hung up on Indonesia, which after all is in the late 1990s. And I felt that when I was writing it, am I just, and I talked to the IMF about this, and they kind of said, no, we've changed. And I don't think they have changed enough. And it's unfortunate the example comes from my own country. In the fall, my country had this kind of budget spasm. And what most of you won't have noticed is that the IMF, the leadership of the IMF, made a statement during that, and they said, this is really appalling, this budget, because it will increase inequality and it will lead to tighter monetary policy. Well, the second is kind of true, and so obvious it barely needed saying, but it was kind of harmless to say it. The first has got absolutely nothing to do with them, even if you agree. It is absolutely not for them to tell us how to organize distributional justice in the country, which is still a functioning democracy, as actually was demonstrated over the following few weeks. And this matters more because of what the fund didn't say. They didn't say, look, you've done all these things, but you've said nothing about your fiscal framework. You've said nothing about why the public finances are going to be sustainable in the long run. And we're going to be looking to you to say something about that. That's their job. And I said this to a journalist when this was going on, and they said, well, it's not so easy. And I said, well, this was in the few minutes after the statement. They said, right, well, here's a possible statement they could have made. I'm not going to do it now. And I just thought of one. And they said, oh, yeah, actually, I see what you mean. And I said, you see, if you know what the job is, and you know, there's no great expertise in this, by the way. It's you instinctively write down what your job is, and you don't pretend you're doing another job. And I don't think that they've got back to that yet. So from there, I'm going to pick up your question about the renminbi with the other one. Document 9. I think the first thing to say about it is that it's very interesting, because China hands know about Document 9, because I discovered it reading books about China by China experts. And I think it's extremely interesting that they didn't ensure you all knew about it. Your challenge is well put, but I don't think is telling, because elsewhere, and I rehearsed this in chapter 9, since Xi's leadership, but a bit before, there are speeches by really big figures that effectively say the party stands above the law, the party stands above the state, the party stands above the Constitution, or in other words, the Constitution means whatever the party kind of want it to mean. And I think that is subtly different from what's addressed in Document 9, but it's of a piece with it. But, a presentation like that is a set of gestures towards arguments rather than a complete argument. I think the quotes, by the way, that I've got, again, translated into English, on those things in chapter 9 are quite instructive. On China and the reserve currency, the first thing I want to say is you should see the debt ceiling debate going on in Washington at the moment in this context. This was this kind of re-emerged after the book had gone to bed. The debt ceiling debate has played out, a decade ago and on other occasions, essentially as beltway politics. I mean, it's tremendously, even though it's crazy, it's tremendously sophisticated and hard-knuckled, and it's seen entirely within the context of domestic party politics. And it's not anymore. If this ends up, I'm trying to be neutral in terms of the domestic politics, if this ends up in a place where there is a technical default, that is an act in international politics, because this calling on my former life, I can promise you there will be presentations around the world, not just from Beijing, but from bankers and asset managers, including from this country, that will say, well, maybe you just like to shade down the proportion of your reserves held in dollar-denominated instruments. And it's not that they'll say, well, go move into renminbi. It may be move into euros or whatever. But it will be, if you start defaulting, you are no longer an unequivocally safe asset. And so the debt ceiling debate and some other things I do talk about in the book are now national security issues. And part of the challenge in domestic politics, especially here, but also in the big European capitals, is to rise to that. Just a point in which our governance has found, thinking over the last 15 years, has kind of stumbled a bit. We probably need a kind of bigger visioned, surer-footed governance than we have needed for many, many decades. I think the point about Saudi Arabia potentially moving to invoice in renminbi is a very big thing. It's certainly a very big thing symbolically if you think about the security relationship, but it's also a very big thing because of a technical issue about the question was, well, why wouldn't authoritarian regimes move to using the renminbi? And the standard arguments, which are very good, are that China doesn't have complete currency convertibility, and it doesn't have the rule of law, and so do you really want to hold this stuff where you don't know whether you'll be able to make good your claim? This is why in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the West decided the Soviets could hold dollars in the Western banking system, they were held largely in the British banking system, not in the American banking system. And that's partly to do with our system of unpoliticized judicial independence. All these things are relative, but that's a big relative difference between the United Kingdom and the United States. And that was related to and how will democracy kind of respond to that? I mean, this is partly all about mistakes. I mean, one of the beautiful things about democracy and the legitimation of democracy is that it separates how we feel about the system of government from how we feel about the government of the day. Because we can kick out the government of the day peacefully at the ballot box without losing faith in the system of government. So it has that kind of flex in it. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, we do, but it's kind of trial and error system where you can make mistakes and recalibrate without losing faith in the system. There are limits to that. The Chinese system is more brittle in a sense. The mandate of heaven goes back before the party. The mandate of heaven is more brittle because the mandate of heaven is essentially an outturns, a welfarist legitimation norm, whereas our own legitimation norm is not just welfarist. Of course, as a kind of follower of Hume, I like this because it's not utilitarian, and it's not entirely deontological, and it's not entirely virtue-based, but it's kind of all of those things, because anyone sane would give weight to all of those things. So our flexibility, our ability to adapt is a strength, and we ought not to be kind of overawed by the sometimes admirable decisiveness and clear-sightedness of regimes in authoritarian countries.
Thank God Liz Truss didn't have the mandate from heaven.
Well, you know.
Got the mandate from growth.
Shall I respond a little bit to Jeff and Aditi? This didn't come up, but was related, I think, to some of the things that Aditi said about swaps, which is, if you've got this great power as the reserve currency issuer, you do need to kind of exercise it with restraint. Of course, that's true of power in general. But the best way of thinking about that isn't just in terms of swaps, these credit lines, but in terms of sanctions. There's a really excellent speech and paper by former US Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who I should declare as a professional friend of mine, not social friends or anything like that, on how the United States should be kind of more restrained in the use of sanctions. And I think there's a kind of lot of wisdom in that speech, and there should be a high bar for saying that things are wise. I think the swaps thing, I mean, you were very kind, actually, because you could easily have pointed out a kind of Marxist-type contradiction between my second book and my first. And my first book is all about central bankers not going too far, and my second book starts off with a sentence that it's terrible that they're not going far enough. Well, and the reason I mention that is the way I see in policy circles and government de-siloism. It isn't that everybody should be doing everybody else's job. It's that you need to be sensitive to where other parts of governments have an issue in things and invested in persuading them that something is of interest to them, even when they can't see it. So in the India swap story case, and I'm making this next bit up entirely, so I have the Federal Reserve going off to the White House and all the State Department and saying, oh, this is going to irritate Delhi a lot. And so silly swaps stuff, central banking, tech stuff, go back and do your interest rates. And I want somebody that says, no, I need to explain to you, you're wrong, it's not just techie stuff. I shouldn't, given my mandate, extend it, and in any case, that's my decision. But you really do need to take this seriously. And I know I'm just sufficiently literate in your part of government that I think I can persuade you of that. And it's for you to decide what to do. And I think the solution would be something like the Treasury Department would extend a line of credit, which might be financed by the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or whoever. The point about order and system, you're the first person to pick this out. And this book's now been out for about 3 or 4 months. I mean, you're right, I think. I think you're right. Certainly, so the easiest way to convey this briefly, which will be incompletely, is I see order as, order with a capital O, as an organic process that produces order with a small o, by which I mean the components of the first political question, the Hobbesian question, order, safety, protection, and some conditions of trust. And I see system as kind of designed under the umbrella of the organic order, but certainly feeding back into it. And I think I try to convey that in chapter 6. But ultimately always, whether it's hegemony or bipolarity or a multipolar order, ultimately determined by relative hard power and relative dispositions. And so it isn't the same. I mean, John Eikenberry, of course, is a man I greatly admire, but I think that his conception or his way of framing order it's just got too many things wrapped up in the same word. And I think unless one thinks the whole thing is designed, I mean, if one thinks the whole thing is designed, then one can use the same word. If one thinks there's an organic process at the level of order, then I think it is unhelpful to unpack it. And the cheapest way of saying, well, it's organic, in that no one designed the rise of China, and no one at the international level designed Document 9, and no one has designed, at an international level, China contesting the international order in the South China Sea and in the North China Sea. But certainly the manner of contesting it and challenging it is played out within the if you like, the conventions of international politics. And this goes to my outer circle, actually, because what lies beyond the pale is the state that says, I'm junking those conventions, which is what Putin has done, but not completely. When that missile went into the Ukraine, I thought one of the most interesting things about that episode was how moderate Putin's language was. It was the language of de-escalation, and of course there exists a de-escalation protocol between Washington and Moscow in a way that I believe doesn't exist currently, which is a scary thing between Washington and Beijing. Oil, just to finally touch on that again.
And that will have to be our
Okay, there's an issue of dirty hands with this, which I don't address much in the book, which is just, this is kind of where, it's not where values and interests don't collide. It's just, the nature of politics is to have to make some hard choices that conflict with some of our values to preserve other of our values. And what our attitude should be to Gulf states in order to preserve our way of life it's a very grown-up question.
I think I have to have the last word on that one, which is the attitude of the British government is to allow them to buy all of our football teams, thereby greenwashing their reputations with sports washing. And on that happy note, thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.